For thousands of years, the Puirnii Empire has reliably been the dominant power in western Milgana. Over the ages, this powerful empire has been respected, feared, and reviled in nearly equal measure. However, when we look at a map of the Fourth Empire today, we see this small, barely significant rump state. So what happened to this once proud conqueror of nations? To answer that satisfactorily, we'll have to go back. Not just back to the events that led to the partition of the Third Puirnii Empire, but back to the very foundations of Puirnii society. Before the concept of nations even made sense, the Olean tribes inhabited these lands. It's unknown whether their culture developed here or migrated from somewhere else, but they were well established here by the time the era of rain ended. It is during the early days, the era of kinship, that the history of the Puirniis truly begins. According to legend, a great empire was forming in the east that could not be stopped. Great armies and heroes clashed against the legions of this empire, and were all crushed. Its conquest over all of Milgana seemed inevitable, and soon all kings and lords simply bowed to the might of this empire as soon as they approached. The lord of the Olean tribe Puirnii was prepared to do the same when the empire turned its attention west. The lord entrusted the delivery of his letter of surrender to his personal courier. However, as the young courier traveled to meet the general of this invading army, he made a choice. He refused to surrender his people's tribe to this illegitimate empire, and with no authority to do so, he told the general his people intended to fight. When the general threatened to raze every city and village to the ground, the courier, on pure impulse, challenged the general to a duel to the death. If he won, the empire must leave these lands forever, and if he died, his entire tribe would be enslaved. When the general asked why he shouldn't simply kill the courier and proceed with his invasion, he responded with a provocation. Accusing the general of cowardice, the courier claimed that if he was so nervous, he should bring backup. After all, this courier was a great warrior, and he could easily best 20 of the finest generals this empire had to offer. Enraged, the general summoned 19 others from across the empire to test the courier's claim. And so it was. The young courier, hardly more than a boy, standing in a pit facing 20 veteran generals of this unbeatable empire. It seemed impossible, but the courier had assistance. You see, each night as he awaited this fateful battle, the courier prayed to the war god Jarg, pleading for assistance in his fight. Impressed by his courage, Jarg pledged the courier so that he would be unbeatable in battle. His faith unwavering, the courier entered the fight without a shred of doubt in his victory. And he would be rewarded for this confidence, as within the hour, the courier stood over the bodies of the 20 best generals of this empire. Soon, the courier returned home a hero, and the people of the Puirnii tribe placed him in charge, declaring him to be their king. However, Jarg had higher expectations of this king. As his chosen champion, King Tirino was to conquer in his name, and conquer he did. King Tirino declared his tribe be blessed by Jarg, and they followed him into battle as he conquered the entire continent of Milgana, obliterating the empire that had seemed so daunting a threat. King Tirino became Emperor Tirino of the First Puirnii Empire, and it said that every ethnic Puirnii to this day is his descendant. Alas, his children were not as faithful to Jarg as Tirino was, and soon enough the continent-spanning First Empire fractured into war and chaos. At least, that's how it's told in Puirnii culture. Tirinism is the belief that Emperor Tirino was chosen by Jarg, and therefore his descendants, all modern Puirniis, are chosen by a god to rule all of Milgana. A core part of this belief is that one day, a descendant of Tirino will once again be chosen as Jarg's champion and conquer all of Milgana. In recent years, many who previously weren't very devout have turned to Tirinism. However, as bombastic as this tale of Puirnii domination is, it doesn't appear to be grounded in much truth. The First Puirnii Empire is shrouded in mystery, but scholars unaffiliated with Tirinism have repeatedly found evidence that the First Empire never extended past this line. In fact, it seems likely that the First Empire never referred to itself as an empire. It likely was just a regular kingdom like any other, only being romanticized retroactively during the reign of the Second Empire, to make it seem as though they were successor to a grand history. Speaking of the Second Empire, it wouldn't rise until thousands of years after the First. Near the end of the era of conquest, in the city-state of Hyra, which was then far from the largest Puirnii city, a military commander named Doral usurped the mayor, taking control for himself. A fantastic orator, Doral's true power was not his military might, but rather his talent for convincing people to support him. He was only able to overthrow the mayor by convincing the guards that what he was doing would support the city. Over the next 20 years, Through a mix of convincing weaker realms to join him and using their power to conquer those who were unwilling, Doril was able to re-establish a kingdom larger than any Puirnii realm since the First Empire. However, unsatisfied, he issued an ultimatum to the 5 Puirnii cities on Lake Duira: Hiftwi, Folin, Gaian, Gioplit, and Bilairo. Each city had 1 year to swear unwavering fealty to him, and he detailed no consequences. Hiftwi, Folin, Gaian, and Gioplit all welcomed him as their king. When Bilairo refused, it was the armies from its 4 sister cities that burned it to the ground. Today, it's unclear exactly when Bilairo was located. Regardless, by the year 3916 of the era of conquest, Doril had conquered all the way to the sea. It was along with this achievement that he finally took the title of Emperor. Thus, his family, the Philero family, would become the ruling dynasty of the Second Puirnii Empire for ages. His succession would prove to be more stable than the First Empire, as Doril, after decades of effort, died only 2 years into his reign, being succeeded by his son. Doril the Great, as he's known today, is the single most important figure in Puirnii history, being posthumously considered infallible in every way. Many Tyrannus temples have grand portrayals of Doril, as they consider him to be the second champion of Jarg. Despite the fact that according to their own faith, the second champion of Jarg was the one who was supposed to conquer the entire continent. And now they await a third champion to finish what he started. As you might have noticed, the Gulf of Doril is named after him. It became common practice that every emperor of the Philero family would annex some land for the empire. I don't just mean that emperors tended to be belligerent, I mean it became tradition that a crucial part of legitimizing an emperor's reign including making some conquest for the empire. Supposedly, Jarg would rain disaster on any Puirnii emperor who didn't go to war for his chosen people. Also, let me just quickly mention that Tyrannism still recognizes the other gods mentioned in the religion video and venerates them. However, as a sacred protector of the Puirnii people, Jarg is seen as the most important, and it's his name that's thrown around as a buzzword when Puirniis talk about the wrath of the gods. Anyways, this led to a situation where most Puirnii emperors would spend the first years of their reign invading and annexing small, insignificant patches of land, just to say that they did conquer for the empire. Still, centuries of this, combined with the effort of the more ambitious emperors, and the empire reached this extent by the year 743 of the era of tyrants. We should also mention the ruling style of the Philero emperors. Traditionally, each emperor was very hands-off with their rule, giving away any and all conquered territories to Puirnii nobles, or in rare cases, nobility of the ethnicity actually populating the area, and only resolve disputes and collect tribute from nobles, otherwise allowing them to govern their lands how they saw fit. This hands-off approach went from a mercy on the part of Doril to a political necessity of the later emperors, who stood no chance of opposing all their vassal realms. Returning to the year 743 of the era of tyrants, this was the year a blight began to spread throughout the empire. Wheat harvests turned up empty, and the bread shortage led to starvation. Over the next 3 years, nearly a quarter of the empire's population starved to death or were killed in the violence that erupted over food. It was amidst this chaos and death that a cousin of the emperor at the time, Dolan VIII, began to rise to popularity by giving public speeches declaring that Jarg was unleashing his wrath on the empire for their neglect of their duty to conquer all of Milgana. This man, Gino of Erlina, was attracting a sizable following of those who enjoyed the scapegoat of the emperor's incompetence. Though Dolan was by no means responsible for hundreds of years of emperors satisfied with the status quo, nor was he responsible for the spread of the blight, he didn't do much to rectify it either. By this point, the emperor was hardly more than a ceremonial position that collected taxes from the various vassal states of the empire, and Dolan seemed comfortable with that. All he did was issue public speeches all about his sympathy for the common people, and that he was praying for an end to the famine. As Gino gained followers, he began to openly question the rule of Dolan. Various vassals of the empire began to stop paying tribute to the emperor. Feeling pressured to take some sort of action, Dolan, by whatever logic he was using, decided to start a war to distract the people and get them to rally behind him. The issue is, he didn't just declare war on a neighboring kingdom or city, he declared a universal state of war. Essentially, he believed it was time for the Puirnii Empire to fulfill its destiny as the suzerain of all of Milgana. As you might expect for the weakened, decentralized empire, with vassals that were openly refusing to pay tribute to their emperor, starving masses that were killing in the streets for bread, and a political rival gaining followers by the day, things did not go well. In fact, the empire went from this to this in just 4 years. During that time, the violence only got worse, and Gino decided it was time to take action. As Puirnii cities fell to the various enemies by the week, Gino and his makeshift army surrounded Hyra and announced their intention to depose Dolan. When he approached the city guards, they simply let him in. And so, on the 16th day of summer, in the year 750 of the era of tyrants, Gino of Verlina, along with his personal entourage, simply walked into the imperial palace and murdered Emperor Dolan VIII, along with his wife and 6 children. Only 2 hours later, he appeared on a balcony before the bustling streets of Hyra and declared the start of the Third Empire. The first thing Emperor Gino I had to do was agree to a surrender. Though it was humiliating for the entire empire, he could easily pass the blame onto the deceased Dolan for the crippling defeat. However, that didn't change the fact that the empire was still reeling from a famine, had just lost over 2/3 of its territories, and most of the remaining land was under control of nobles who were no longer answering to Hyra. Thus, Gino took a risk, and declared that the most powerful of the rogue vassals, the Duke of Verlogui, was stripped of all his titles, and that any other vassal could legally invade and become ruler of his lands, provided they acknowledged the emperor's rule and paid their tribute. Though this abuse of power had the potential to backfire, it worked magnificently. The Prince of Defairi, a neighboring vassal, invaded, and with Gino's assistance, became ruler of Verlogui. Gino rewarded him with his own daughter's hand in marriage. And so a strategy was formed, to use the more loyal and ambitious vassals to conquer the rebellious. And every time this was done successfully, the loyal would be rewarded. To the scholarly Lord of Nalai, he gave ancient Puirnii texts from the imperial archives. To the avaricious Duke of Ritelli, he gave a set of solid gold cutlery. By 765 of the Third Era, the entire remaining empire was fiercely and personally loyal to Emperor Gino, and it was only then that he began the reconquests. Over the next 8 years, Gino orchestrated the recapturing of this land, aided by exiled Puirnis living in the territories. While nowhere near the extent of the Second Empire at its height, it was a notable start, and it was the empire that Emperor Gino died in. Not the legendary hero that Doral is still revered as, Emperor Gino the Wise is still respected and seen as one of the greatest Puirnis in history, and his Relina dynasty would rule for the entirety of the Third Empire. Speaking of the entirety of the Third Empire, that brings us to the year 2723 of the Third Era. This is the Third Puirnii Empire, on the eve of the war that would be the most catastrophic for the Puirni since the collapse of the Second Empire, and the deadliest in the history of Milgana. Let's do something we haven't done yet, and look at the empire from a non-Puirni point of view. The Third Puirnii Empire was an ethnocentric, xenophobic slaver empire that conquered what it pleased and mistreated anyone who wasn't Puirni by blood. For example, the Filks in the north of the empire. They were ruled by Puirni lords and dukes, and often forced to live in the worst neighborhoods of their own cities. A crime for which a Puirni might only pay a small fine, a Filk would be enslaved for life. Even if they moved to a wealthier city in the Puirni heartland, they would still be discriminated against, not permitted to join the imperial army or get much business from Puirnis if they knew a trade. And this was true across the empire. Alines and those from the various other Alian tribes were treated well, but Faltans, Hiscarers, Tilors, and other groups native to the lands controlled by the empire faced similar difficulties to the Filks. Centuries of this brought a lasting resentment that could not be easily rectified, and a younger empire to the east was well aware of this fact and what it could mean. Thank you very much for watching part 1 of the Puirnii Empire series. Like if you liked, subscribe if you feel like it, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.